In 1892, a young monk walked down the coast of southern India and came away with a phrase he never took back. He called the place a lunatic asylum. He was not describing its hospitals, he was describing its caste system. Here, a man born to the wrong family could not use a public road, not because a gate stopped him, because the sight of him, at a certain distance, was treated as a kind of contamination. Some castes were required to stay 32 feet from others, some 64. A man of low birth walking a temple street had to call out as he went, so those above him could step away in time. There were schools. They taught the few. Letters were a privilege of birth, held in the same hand as gold ornaments and tiled roofs. 100 years later, the same strip of coast held the highest literacy rate in India. Not by a narrow margin. 94% at the last full census. Life expectancy near 75 years. Infant mortality around 6 deaths for every 1,000 births. A number that sits closer to Portugal than to the country it belongs to. And a per capita income below several Indian states, it beats on every measure of a human life. Both of these things are true about the same ground. The most rigid caste order in India, the most literate society in India, separated by a single century. This is Kerala, 38,000 square kilometers of it, a strip of land pressed between the Arabian Sea and a wall of mountains, never more than 120 kilometers wide. 35 million people live inside it, more than Australia, in an area smaller than Denmark. Something happened here in between those two facts. It did not begin in a parliament. It did not begin in a factory. It began with paper. So what did the reading actually do? It is 4 in the morning in Kottayam, and the town is doing the one thing it has always done best. Somewhere on the road out of the press, a van slows without stopping. A bundle of newsprint drops onto wet tarmac, still warm, bound with plastic twine. A man on a bicycle cuts the twine with a thumbnail. By 5, the papers are on verandas, over gates, wedged into the grills of front doors, along roads that have no names. By 6, the tea shops are open and the arguing has started. Kottayam is not a large town, around 100,000 people in the municipal limits, sitting inland where the backwaters give way to rubber country. It has no port. It has no industry worth the word. What it has is presses. 3 of the oldest newspapers in the Malayalam language were born within a few kilometers of one another here. Deepika, first printed in 1887. Malayalam Manorama, first printed on the 14th of March, 1888, by a man named Kandathil Varghese Mapillai, who ran it as a weekly out of a small building with a hand-fed press. That weekly is now the largest circulating regional language newspaper in India. Around 1.8 million copies every morning in a language spoken by almost nobody outside this coast. 2 out of every 3 newspaper readers in Kerala open the same masthead. The district those presses sit in has a literacy rate of 97%, the highest of any district in India. In 1938, the state banned that newspaper. The press was sealed. The editor was imprisoned. The paper did not appear again for 9 years, and when it returned, the country it printed in had changed its name and its flag. Hold on to that. It matters later, in a place 40 kilometers north of here, where a single editorial did something a newspaper is not supposed to be able to do. The reading habit here is not a private one. It is furniture. A Kerala tea shop is not built around tea. It is built around a bench, a wall, and whoever is holding the paper. The paper is read aloud. Sections are separated and passed sideways. A man who cannot read well enough will still take his portion and hold it, because holding it is part of belonging to the room. Across the state, there are more than 8,000 village libraries registered under a single council. Not private collections, not city institutions. Village libraries. One room, a few shelves, a reading table by a window in settlements of 2,000 people. Somebody had to build all of that. Somebody had to teach 35 million people to want it. That is the question this place keeps quiet about, and it has an answer. A specific one, with a date, a district, and a number of volunteers. We will get there. East of the town, the ground begins to climb. Rubber gives way to pepper. Pepper gives way to cardamom. And then the cultivated land runs out entirely against the Western Ghats, a mountain wall that runs 1,600 kilometers down the western edge of India, catching the monsoon before it can reach the interior. These forests hold a bird that Kerala chose as its own. The great hornbill stands 1.5 meters from beak to tail. On top of its bill sits a hollow yellow casque, curved like the crest of a helmet, made of keratin and almost entirely empty air. Nobody is certain what it is for. It may amplify sound. It may be a signal of age and fitness to other hornbills. It weighs almost nothing. What the bird does with its nest is stranger. The female selects a cavity high in a rainforest tree. She goes inside, and then she seals herself in, walling up the entrance with mud, bark, and her own droppings until only a narrow vertical slit remains, too thin for a snake or a monkey to pass. For the next 3 to 4 months, she cannot leave. She molts her flight feathers while confined. Everything she and the chicks eat arrives through that slit, delivered by the male, 1 fig at a time. If he is killed, the family inside the tree dies with him. The hornbill needs old trees to do this. Cavities that size take a century to form, which means every nesting pair is evidence that a particular patch of forest has been left alone for longer than any government here has existed. They are still nesting in these hills. That is not a small thing to be able to say about a coast this crowded. To understand why this coast reads, you have to understand what it sold. 60 kilometers north of Kochi, a village called Pattanam sits on flat ground between coconut palms and a sluggish backwater. There is nothing to look at. A few brick houses, a road, a church. Under the topsoil, there is a port. Since 2007, archaeologists have pulled Roman amphorae out of this ground, glass beads from the Mediterranean, fragments of a wooden wharf, storage jars still carrying the residue of what they held. This, most historians now believe, is Muziris. Pliny the Elder called it the first emporium of India. A Tamil poem from the same centuries describes ships of the Yavanas, the Greeks and Romans, arriving on the Periyar River with gold and leaving with pepper. The trade was not small. Roman writers complained about it. Coin hoards from the period turn up along this coast in quantities that suggest a steady drain of imperial silver eastward, year after year, in exchange for a dried berry. Pepper grows on a vine. It needs heat, height, and a monsoon. Almost nowhere in the ancient world could give it all three. This coast could. So the world came here. Romans, Arabs, Chinese, Jews from Judea, by tradition arriving in the 1st century. Christians, by tradition, arriving with the Apostle Thomas in the year 52. Muslim traders, whose mosque at Colonial is held by local tradition to be among the oldest in the subcontinent. They were not conquerors. They were merchants waiting for the wind to turn. The monsoon runs one way for half the year and the other way for the rest, which meant a trader who missed his window lived here for 6 months. Many of them simply stayed. Then the port disappeared. Around the year 1341, the Periyar comes down in flood. The river shifts its channel. Silt fills the harbour mouth over a season or a few seasons, and the deep water that made Muziris possible is simply no longer there. Ships stop arriving. The town that Rome had paid in silver for 1,000 years becomes farmland. Nothing about the loss was announced. There is no chronicle of the last ship. The place slid out of the world's ledger and stayed out of it for 600 years, until somebody dug a foundation trench in a village and found Roman glass. The trade moved south to a new natural harbour at Kochi, and the cosmopolitan habit, the assumption that strangers arrive, settle, and become part of the arrangement, moved with it. 200 kilometers up the coast, that habit met something it had not encountered before. Kozhikode was the seat of the Zamarin, the ruler who controlled the northern pepper trade. Foreign merchants here had extraordinary privileges. They held their own courts, they kept their own laws. The Zamarin's navy was commanded for generations by a Muslim family. It was one of the most open commercial cities in the medieval world, which is precisely why the door was standing wide when the wrong ships came through it. On the 20th of May, 1498, 3 Portuguese vessels anchored off a beach at Capad, a few kilometers north of the city. Vasco da Gama had come around the southern tip of Africa and crossed the Indian Ocean with a pilot he picked up on the Swahili coast. He had almost nothing to trade. The gifts he offered the Zamarin, cloth, hats, sugar, honey, were laughed at by merchants who dealt in gemstones. What he had instead was a route. And behind the route, within 20 years, came cannon. The openness that made this coast rich is the same openness that ended its control of its own market. Both facts hold. The place that welcomed the world for 1,500 years lost its independence to the first visitor who arrived with a fleet. The Portuguese seized the pepper trade. The Dutch took it from them in the 17th century. The British took it from the Dutch. And then something quieter happened in a hill town north of here called Thalassery. In June 1847, a German missionary named Hermann Gundert printed the first newspaper in the Malayalam language. It was a monthly bulletin, part news and part scripture, and it existed to be read by people the local order had never intended to teach. Gundert also compiled the first serious Malayalam dictionary, a German cataloguing a language he had learned as an adult so that its own speakers could see it written down. The presses spread. In 1923, Mathrubhumi began printing in Kozhikode, founded as a nationalist paper by men who expected to be jailed for it. And with the presses came something this coast has never entirely lost: the idea that a poem is public business. Malayalam literary magazines carried verse to villages the way other places carried market prices. Poets here were read by farmers. A poem could still be news. Hold that too. In 60 years, a poem is going to stop a dam. But none of it explains the schools. A press needs readers. In 1847, this coast had almost none. Something had to come first. It came from a palace in Tiruvananthapuram, and it came early. The year is 1817. In the kingdom of Travancore, a regent in her early 20s sits with a British-appointed advisor and issues a written order about children she will never meet. Her name is Rani Gauri Parvati Bai. She rules because the heirs are too young, and she will rule for 14 years. The order states that the state should bear the entire cost of the education of its people, so that there might be no backwardness in the spread of enlightenment among them, so that they might become better subjects and public servants, and so that the reputation of the state might be advanced. Read that date again, 1817. Britain would not accept a comparable duty to its own children for another 50 years. Compulsory schooling in most of Europe was still an argument, not a law. And here, in a small Hindu kingdom on the edge of the Indian Ocean, a government committed itself in writing to paying for the letters of everyone it governed. It did not work as written. Of course it did not. Caste made sure of that. The vernacular schools that followed opened doors to communities previously shut out of learning, but the lowest castes stayed outside. A Pulaya child could not enter a schoolyard whose ground he was not permitted to walk on. The promise existed on paper for people who were not permitted to stand near the paper. But a promise on paper is a strange kind of object. It can be quoted back. For the next 120 years, every movement that demanded a place in Travancore's schools could point at the same sentence and ask why it applied to some and not others. The state had already conceded the principle in 1817. All that remained was the arithmetic of who counted as its people. Travancore abolished school fees in its government schools in 1904, a full generation before most of British India. Missionary societies built schools for girls and for the lowest castes, in part out of conviction and in part out of competition. Caste organizations then built their own schools so their communities would not fall behind the converts. Every group in the kingdom was, for its own reasons, in a race to educate itself. On the 12th of November 1936, the Maharaja of Travancore signed a proclamation opening every temple under state control to all Hindus, regardless of caste. It was the first order of its kind in India. It came 119 years after the sentence about education, and it came because of what happened at a small temple town on the backwaters, which we will come to shortly. Then, in 1957, the state did something the world watched. Kerala had existed as a state for 4 months. In its first election, the Communist Party of India won 60 of 126 seats and formed a government under Elamkulam Manakal Sankaran Nambudiripad, a Brahmin landowner's son who had spent his adult life organizing against people like his family. It was one of the first communist governments anywhere in the world to take office through a competitive election rather than a war. Its 2 main projects were land and schools. The first aimed to break the tenancy system that kept most farmers paying rent to landlords they would never meet. The second brought private-aided schools under state rules on teacher qualifications, appointments, and salaries. The second one broke the government. Church managements, caste organizations, and the opposition combined into a mass agitation. Streets filled, schools closed. In July 1959, the central government in Delhi dismissed the ministry and imposed direct rule. The reforms did not die with it. Land legislation returned in 1963 and was finally implemented in the 70s, and by the end of it, hundreds of thousands of tenant households owned the ground they stood on. Two political fronts have alternated in power here almost without exception ever since. Whichever wins, the schools stay funded and the ration shops stay open. That is the one thing here that does not change with a government. There is an animal in these hills that spends 50 weeks of the year in a place nobody can watch. The purple frog was unknown to science until 2003. It is squat, glossy, dark violet, roughly the size of a fist, with a small, pointed snout and eyes that seem too small for its head. It looks less like a frog than like something inflating. It lives underground, not in a burrow near the surface, down in the soil, among tree roots and loose rock, where it feeds on termites through a groove in its mouth. Using a tongue, it can extend without opening its jaws. For most of the year, it does not surface at all. Then, the first heavy rains of the southwest monsoon soak the hillside, and for a few days, the frogs come up to breed in temporary streams. Then, they go back down. Its closest living relatives are not in India. They are in the Seychelles, 4,000 kilometers out in the Indian Ocean, a family of small frogs stranded on granite islands when the land masses separated. Which means this animal's lineage was already ancient when the Western Ghats took their present shape. It has been sitting under this soil, unobserved, through every empire that ever claimed the surface. Almost nobody in Kerala has seen one. It is on the state's list of protected species anyway. "40 kilometers west of Kottayam, where the land flattens into water, there is a temple town called Vaikom. In the 1920s, the 4 roads around its temple were closed to most of the people who live beside them. Not the temple, the roads. A Pulaya or an Ejava, communities that together made up the majority of the population, could not walk the public street outside the wall. There was no ambiguity about it. The prohibition was posted, policed, and enforced by the state. In December 1917, a young journalist named T.K. Madhavan wrote an editorial arguing that temples funded by everyone's taxes should be open to everyone. He was an Ejava. He could not have walked to the temple he was writing about. But the newspaper could. That is the thing about print in a society organized around distance. A man forbidden to come within 64 feet of another man could put a sentence in his hands. The page did not observe the rule. It went where the writer could not go, into houses that would not have admitted him, and it was read aloud in tea shops to people who could not read it themselves. On the 30th of March 1924, 3 men walked onto the forbidden roads and were arrested. The next morning, 3 more. Then 3 more. The police stopped arresting them and put up barricades instead. So the protesters sat in front of the barricades. Through the monsoon. Through a flood that put the whole town under water, when volunteers stood in chest-deep water at the barrier because leaving would have ended the claim. It lasted 604 days. The day before it began, on the 29th of March 1924, Malayalam ran an editorial asking a question in public that had never been asked in public. If a revered teacher and a celebrated poet could be driven off a road by a drunk man invoking caste, could their people be expected to accept it? And if they rose, could any authority stop them by force? That is the same newspaper the state would silence 14 years later. Sikh volunteers arrived from Punjab and set up kitchens to feed the protesters. A Tamil reformer, E.V. Ramasamy, came, spoke, and was jailed twice. Mahatma Gandhi came and negotiated. The settlement was partial. 3 of the 4 roads opened. The Eastern Road stayed shut for another 11 years until the proclamation of 1936. Nobody involved described it as a victory. Ramasamy was so unsatisfied with the compromise that he broke with Gandhi over it and spent the rest of his life arguing that reform inside a caste order was a contradiction in terms. But the method had been proved on this coast. A grievance published, a body of readers assembled, a non-violent occupation sustained for 2 years by people who had read about why they were standing there. Every mass campaign this state has run since, for land, for schools, for a rainforest, for literacy itself, has used some version of the same machinery. 20 kilometers west of Vaikom, the land gives up on being land. Kutanad is a delta of rice fields, canals, and narrow raised paths, and much of it lies below the level of the sea. Farmers here built earthen bunds around their fields, then pumped the water out from inside, a technique they were using long before anyone gave it a name. In the wet season, the boats sit higher than the crops. Once a year, on Punamada Lake, the villagers race snake boats over 100 feet long, crewed by 100 rowers, steered by 4 men standing at the stern. The chant that keeps them in time is a form older than the race. In August 1909, in a village in this delta called Nilamparur, a boy was born into a family without much land. His name was Putuvayil Narayana Panikar. He became a village schoolteacher, and he had a habit that struck people who saw it as slightly odd. He read the newspaper out loud in the evening to whoever gathered, farm laborers, older women, people who had never been given a reason to learn letters and did not expect to. In 1926, aged 17, he started a library in his own village. Then he began asking other villagers why they did not have one. In 1945, he gathered 47 rural libraries into a single association, with a slogan you still see painted on reading room walls in this state: Read and Grow. 47. Hold that number against the 8,000 libraries registered here today, and the arithmetic of what happened in between becomes the real story of Kerala. He spent 50 years traveling to villages to argue that a room with books in it was a public utility, like a well. He died on the 19th of June, 1995. That date is now Reading Day in Kerala. Since 2017, it has been Reading Day for the whole of India. North of the delta, in the flat coastal country of Malappuram, the reading state runs into its hardest arithmetic. This is the district that sends the most people away. Ponani, on the coast here, was for centuries a center of Islamic learning, a town where students came from across southern India to study, and where scholars wrote Malayalam in Arabic script, a hybrid alphabet built to carry one language in another's letters. Literacy here is older than the state that measures it. It is also the district where the deepest wound in Kerala's modern history was made. In 1921, a rebellion broke out across South Malabar. It began as a movement against colonial rule and the landlord system, and it turned, in places, into communal violence against Hindu neighbors. The British answered with martial law and mass arrests. On the night of the 19th of November 1921, around 100 prisoners were loaded into a sealed railway goods wagon at Tirur station for transfer to a prison in Podanur. The wagon had no ventilation. The journey took the night. When it was opened, More than 60 men were dead. They had suffocated. Others died later in hospital. There is a memorial hall in Tirua now. The wagon had a number. It was 1711. 50 years after that, this district began emptying in a different way. Oil money in the Gulf created a demand for labor, and Kerala, literate, English-speaking, with more qualified people than jobs, supplied it. Carpenters, nurses, drivers, engineers, accountants. By the 1980s, remittances were the largest single force in this economy. The state's own migration survey counted around 2.2 million Keralites living abroad in 2023. The money they sent home that year came to more than 2 lakh crore rupees, roughly $26 billion, into a state of 35 million people. You can see it in the architecture. 2-story houses with pillared porches and tiled compounds stand along village roads in districts with no industry, built entirely out of money earned 2,000 kilometers away. The surveyors who did the counting reported something they had not expected. In village after village, they arrived at houses on their sample list and found them locked. Not empty for the afternoon. Locked and shuttered, gardens overgrown, because the entire household had gone. Remember the locked houses. Inland from all of it, the mountains keep their own accounting. At 2,000 meters above the T and the cloud line, the forest thins into grassland, broken by cliffs. This is the habitat of the Nilgiri tahr, a stocky wild goat, dark-coated, with short curved horns and hooves built for rock. The males are called saddlebacks for the pale patch that spreads across the back as they age. They graze on open slopes and, when disturbed, move onto ground that would kill anything following them. Near vertical rock, where a hoof placement is measured in centimeters. By the middle of the 20th century, hunting and habitat loss had reduced them to a few hundred animals across the whole of the Western Ghats. The largest surviving population lives in a single national park on the Kerala side of the range, where the tahr have grown so used to people that they walk past visitors on the road without lifting their heads. There are perhaps 3,000 of them left on Earth. Around half are within a day's drive of a town, where you can buy a newspaper at 4 in the morning. The tea below them is not native either. The year is 1877. In the high country east of Kochi, a British planter negotiates with the chief of Punjab for rights over a block of hills nobody is farming. The chief signs. The hills are cold, wet, and empty, and the deal seems generous to both sides. Within 30 years, the slopes are stripped, terraced, and planted with tea. Workers are brought from the plains of Tamil Nadu, thousands of them walking up through the Ghats to camps at altitude where the temperature falls near freezing at night. Their descendants are still there. They still pick the same bushes. The estate lines they live in were built for a workforce that was never expected to become a community, and became one anyway. Every 12 years, the grasslands above the T do something that has no practical explanation. A shrub called Nila Kurinji flowers. Not a few plants, all of them at once, across entire hillsides, turning the slopes blue-violet for several weeks. Then, every flowering plant dies, and the seed spends the next 12 years growing back into a plant that will do it again. The best theory is arithmetic. By flowering on a long, fixed cycle, the plant produces more seed than any seed-eating animal population can adapt to exploit. Predators cannot build up numbers on a 12-year meal, The strategy is to be overwhelming, rarely. The last mass bloom drew crowds up the mountain roads for weeks. People took leave from work for it. Some of them were seeing it for the second time in their lives and knew it would be the last. North and south of the hills, the state runs out in fragments. At Kolam, cashew is still cracked and shelled in factories where the work is done almost entirely by women. In Pathanamthitta, so many households live on foreign wages that the district is used as a shorthand for remittance economies. At Vakala, a red laterite cliff drops straight into the Arabian Sea, and families come to the beach below to perform the last rites for their dead. At Thrissur, once a year, elephants and drums fill a temple ground for a festival that 100,000 people attend in the heat. In Kannur, in the dry months, men become gods. The Thayam performers, painted, costumed and crowned, who dance through the night in village shrines and are addressed, while they dance, as deities. Many of them come from the same castes that were once kept off the temple roads. And in Kasaragod, at the northern tip, ordinary conversation runs through Malayalam, Tulu, Kannada, Konkani, Beri, Marathi, and Urdu, sometimes inside the same family. Then, in the middle of the state, a mountain wall breaks. The Palakkad Gap is about 30 kilometers wide, the only significant break in 1,600 kilometers of the Western Ghats. Wind comes through it from the interior, so does traffic and rail, and everything that has ever entered Kerala by land rather than by sea. North of that gap, on the upper reaches of a river called the Kunti Puja, is the place where this state's reading habit did something no one had planned for. Silent Valley is around 90 square kilometers of tropical evergreen rainforest in a fold of the hills, undisturbed. It is called silent because of what is missing from it. The cicada noise that fills most Indian forests is unusually sparse here. In the early 1970s, the State Electricity Board proposed a dam on the Kunti Puja, 240 megawatts of power, irrigation for 10,000 hectares. Kerala needed both. The Planning Commission approved it in 1973. The reservoir would have drowned around 8 square kilometers of the valley floor, the core of it. What stopped it was not a court. It was an organization called the Kerala Shastra Sahitya Parishad, literally the Kerala Science Literature Society, founded in 1962 by scientists and teachers to publish science in Malayalam for people who had no formal training in it. They wrote pamphlets, they ran village meetings, they published a technical critique of the project's own economics in the state language and put it in the hands of readers who had been taught for a century that arguments in print were their business. The poet Sugata Kumari took it to the public in verse, a poem addressed to a tree, read aloud at gatherings across the state until it functioned as the campaign's anthem. It was not a popular position at first. The state government supported the dam. So did the unions. The valley was remote and the electricity was not. The campaign lasted more than a decade. In 1983, the central government cancelled the project. In 1984, the valley was notified as a national park. India's environmental movement generally dates its own beginning to this. A rainforest in a poor state was saved by a public that read a scientific argument and agreed with it. What lives in that valley is an animal you are unlikely to see even standing under it. The lion-tailed macaque is small, black-coated, with a silver-grey mane framing a bare face and a tufted tail that gave it its name. It is endemic to the Western Ghats and nowhere else on the planet. It spends its life in the canopy. Unlike almost every other monkey in India, It does not come down to raid crops, does not beg at temples, and avoids the ground so consistently that a road cut through its forest can divide a population permanently.
It feeds mainly on fruit,
And on one tree in particular, a canopy species whose fruiting season it tracks across the forest. It has cheek pouches for storing food while moving. Females stay in the group they were born into for life. A single infant is born every 3 years or so, which is an extraordinarily slow rate of replacement for a monkey. There are thought to be fewer than 4,000 left. Silent Valley and its surrounding forest hold one of the largest continuous populations. During the campaign, its face was printed on pamphlets and carried into meetings in villages 100 kilometers from any rainforest. People who would never see one argued for it anyway. Not every part of this state has been protected that well. Wayanad sits high in the northeast, on a plateau above the Ghats, where coffee and pepper grow between remnants of forest, and the districts of 2 neighboring states press against the border. It has the lowest literacy rate in Kerala. It is still above the national average. It also has the largest Adivasi population in the state, communities who lived in these hills before the plantations and who hold a disproportionate share of Kerala's landlessness, its malnutrition, and its school dropouts. The model that made this state famous is thinnest, exactly where the ground is steepest. On the 30th of July 2024, after days of extreme rain, a hillside above the settlements of Mundakai and Churamala gave way in the dark. The debris flow traveled several kilometers down a stream channel and through 2 villages while people were asleep. More than 280 were confirmed dead. Bodies were recovered from a river in the next district. Scores were never found at all. It was the deadliest landslide in Kerala in living memory, and it came 6 years after the deadliest floods. In August 2018, the monsoon delivered more rain than the state's dams could hold. Reservoirs were opened, rivers took towns. 483 people died, and more than 1 million spent time in relief camps. What Kerala did next has been studied since. Fishermen from the coast drove their boats inland on trailers and went into flooded neighborhoods to pull people off roofs, unpaid and unasked. A generation of volunteers ran the relief operation from laptops. The state's health system prevented the epidemic that usually follows water on that scale. 3 months before the water came, the same state had faced something quieter and worse. In May 2018, a man in a village in Kozhikode district fell ill with a fever nobody could place. Within days, members of his family were in hospital with the same symptoms. The virus was identified as Nipah, carried by fruit bats, transmitted between people through bodily fluids, with no vaccine and no specific treatment. 23 people were infected. 21 of them died. What contained it was not medicine. There was no medicine. It was a list. Health workers traced more than 2,000 contacts of the known cases, visited them, and monitored them daily. Hospitals were reorganized around isolation protocols within a week. The outbreak was over in about a month. A nurse who treated the first patients, Lini Puthusari, died of the infection at 31. She had written a note to her husband before she was intubated. When a single case appeared in Ernakulam the following year, the contact tracing began the same day, and the patient survived. None of that works without a population that answers the door and tells the truth to a stranger with a clipboard. There is one more piece of the machinery, and it is the newest. In 1998, the state began organizing women into neighborhood groups, 10 to 20 per group, meeting weekly, saving small amounts together, and lending it out among themselves. The network was called Kudumbashri, which translates roughly as prosperity of the family. It now has more than 4.5 million members. In a state of 35 million people, that is close to 1 adult woman in 3. The groups run micro-enterprises, canteens, waste collection, farming collectives. They also turn out to be the fastest way to move information through a village. During the floods, and again during the Nipah outbreak, the relief lists and the health messaging traveled along a network that had been built for savings. That capacity did not come from nowhere either. It is the same machinery, organized, literate, argumentative, and used to being asked to show up. Which brings us back to the question this whole coast has been circling. Somebody had to teach them. In 1988, in the district of Ernakulam, the district that contains Kochi, the port that inherited Muziris trade when the river closed it, a group of officials, teachers, and volunteers sat down with a census figure and decided it was unacceptable. The figure was this: Ernakulam was one of the most educated districts in one of the most educated states in India. Its literacy rate was around 77%, which meant that roughly 150,000 adults inside it could not read. They were not evenly distributed. They were in the coastal fishing settlements, in the urban colonies, in the tribal hamlets on the eastern edge, the same places that appear at the bottom of every table this state produces. Most of them were women. Most were over 40. Many had been in a classroom for a year or two as children and had lost it since. The conventional answer to this was a government program with a budget, a staff, and a 5-year horizon. They did something else. They wrote a project document and called it Lead Kindly Light, after a hymn from 1833 about walking forward without being able to see the road. Then, they built a district literacy society with the district collector as its chairman and staffed it almost entirely with people who were not being paid. The first move was a survey, door to door, household by household, across the whole district, not to estimate the number who could not read, but to write down their names. That distinction is the entire method. A statistic cannot be visited. A name can. The second move was noise. Cultural troupes went into the streets with plays, songs, and processions about reading, performances staged in markets and at bus stands and at the edge of paddy fields, so that the campaign arrived as an event rather than a policy. Literacy marches walked from panchayat to panchayat. The third move was the classrooms, and this is where the last 170 years arrive at once. There were no new buildings. The classes were held in whatever room a village already had. Reading rooms, village libraries, the ones a schoolteacher from Kutanad had spent 50 years arguing into existence, one room at a time, starting with 47 of them. Tea shops after closing, church halls, temple porches, the verandas of houses. Around 35,000 volunteers taught in them. Students mostly, teenagers who had been in school themselves the year before, sitting on the floor with women 3 times their age in the evenings after work for months. Around 650,000 people passed through the campaign. The 4th of February 1990, the Prime Minister of India stands in Ernakulam and declares it the first fully literate district in the country. Independent evaluators have tested the target group and certified the result. The people in front of him are not officials. They are learners, holding certificates, most of them women, many of them in their 50s and 60s. Some of them had signed their name for the first time that year. The state then did the same thing to itself. A statewide survey in April 1990 counted the people who could not read. 2.85 million of them, across 14 districts. The same machinery went out again: the names, the troops, the volunteers, the rooms that already existed. On the 18th of April 1991, Kerala was declared the first fully literate state in India. The census that year put the number at 90.9%. By the most recent measurements, it is around 96. And that is what the morning paper actually is: 1.8 million copies of a single Malayalam daily in a language with no international market, arriving before dawn in a state where the reading was assembled by hand, by a Queen's sentence in 1817, by a German printer in 1847, by an editorial in 1924, by a schoolteacher with 47 libraries in 1945, and by 35,000 unpaid teenagers in 1989. Not one of those steps produced literacy on its own. Each one made the next one possible. The schoolteacher lived to see it. Puttuvayal Narayana Panikar was 81 years old on the day in Ernakulam, and the organization he founded after the state took over his libraries had helped build the literacy mission that ran the campaign. He died 5 years later, on the 19th of June. Every year on that date, schools across this state hold a reading week. Children are photographed holding books. It is a small, slightly formal occasion of the kind most countries reserve for a war. Kochi itself absorbed all of this the way it has absorbed everything. The old harbour still holds the shore-operated lift nets that arrived here from the Chinese coast centuries ago, dipping and rising on their wooden frames at the mouth of the estuary. A street behind the waterfront is still called Jewtown, and the synagogue at the end of it has stood since 1568, floored with hand-painted Chinese tiles, no two identical. The community that built it has almost entirely gone, to Israel mostly, in the decades after 1948. The building is kept. The last families are counted in single figures. The clock tower still carries Hebrew numerals on one face and Malayalam on another. In the forests above all of it lives a butterfly found nowhere but these mountains. The Malabar banded peacock has black wings crossed by a band of metallic blue-green, and the color is not pigment. It is structure, microscopic ridges on the scales that cancel some wavelengths of light and reflect others, so the band changes with the angle of the sun and disappears entirely when the wings are folded. It is a creature of the evergreen forest, most visible after rain, when males gather at wet ground and sand to draw up minerals from the mud. Its caterpillars feed on a small number of trees in one family, which means the butterfly cannot move where the forest does not go. It is a measure of the Ghats, the way the hornbill is, present only where enough has been left standing. There is a habit in the way the world talks about this place. Kerala gets filed under one explanation at a time. Sometimes it is the communists, the land reform, the ration shops, the public hospitals. Sometimes it is the Gulf money, the remittances, the two-story houses, the nurses in 100 countries. Both of those are real. Both of them are late. The order matters. The rescript is 1817. The first newspaper is 1847. The temple roads open in 1925 and the temples in 1936. The libraries begin gathering in 1945. The first communist ministry takes office in 1957. The Gulf boom does not begin until the middle of the 1970s. The reading came first. Everything else grew in ground that could already read, including the politics, which had to argue for votes among people who were checking the argument. What that reading bought in the end was mobility, and mobility, by definition, goes somewhere else. This is now the oldest state in India. More than 1 in 6 Keralites is over 60, and the fertility rate has been below replacement for over 30 years. The nurses this state trains are in Manchester and Toronto and Riyadh. The graduates it educates apply for jobs it does not have. Student migration alone has doubled in 5 years, which brings back the locked houses. The surveyors found them everywhere, and the houses were not derelict. They were good houses, recently built, with the electricity paid up and the gate padlocked. Someone in the Gulf is still sending money to maintain a building that no member of the family has slept in for years. There is a version of that story where it ends badly, and a version where it does not, and nobody here knows which one is running. Under those hills, meanwhile, a purple frog is doing what it has done through every one of these arrangements. It is sitting in the soil, blind to all of it, waiting for rain that will bring it to the surface for a few days. 50 weeks out of sight, 2 on the record. Most of what lasts in a place is like that. Not the declarations or the ceremonies, but the thing under the ground that nobody photographs. A room with a few shelves, a bench in a tea shop, a bundle of newsprint hitting wet tarmac at 4 in the morning. Kerala built the most literate society in India out of a caste order a monk once called an asylum, and it did it without becoming rich. It has not yet worked out how to keep the people it made. Thank you for watching. Until the next journey.